Emma adjusted the cuff of her second-hand blouse as she stepped through the polished glass doors of Regency Wardrobe, the most exclusive boutique on Fifth Avenue. It was a world of luxury she could never afford, but one she was expected to maintain with a smile. Every corner of the boutique gleamed with elegance, polished marble floors, gilded mirrors, and rows of designer dresses priced higher than her monthly rent. Emma had been working there for 3 months, but each day felt like a silent test. She was doomed to fail. Her manager, Melissa, didn't hide her disdain. From the very beginning, she treated Emma not as a sales associate, but as background noise, someone to clean the storeroom, pick up her dry cleaning, and fetch her triple-shot lattes with oat milk and honey. Despite being hired to assist customers, Emma rarely got the chance. Melissa would assign her meaningless errands that kept her away from the floor, and when Emma did manage to make a sale, Melissa found a way to take the commission for herself. "It's store policy," she'd say, with a smirk, snatching the receipt from Emma's hands before walking off in her designer heels. Other senior staff members weren't any better. They mocked Emma's modest wardrobe, whispered about her behind her back, and regularly hijacked her clients the moment they sensed a big purchase. Emma often stood quietly in the corner, watching others ring up sales. She had started her name nowhere on the sales board, her bank account just as empty. But Emma endured. She showed up every morning 10 minutes early, rain or shine, her long brown hair tied back neatly, shoes polished, and not a single thread out of place. She took mental notes of designer trends, learned client preferences, and memorized the store layout better than anyone else. Though her job felt thankless, she carried herself with quiet dignity, while others chased after elite clients and whispered sweet lies for a commission. Emma found satisfaction in folding dresses with care, restocking shelves just so, and ensuring every hanger faced the same direction. Her kindness wasn't performative, it was simply who she was. Melissa, of course, saw Emma's gentleness as weakness. "You need to be more assertive," she'd snap while applying lipstick behind the counter. "This isn't charity work, it's sales." But Emma wasn't interested in playing office politics or clawing her way to the top. She just wanted to earn an honest living, save enough to move out of her shared apartment, and maybe one day go back to school. At night, she would sit at her tiny kitchen table, studying fashion catalogs and sketching designs on printer paper, dreaming of a future where she could create beauty instead of folding someone else's. Even with her dreams tucked away, Emma never let bitterness poison her spirit. She greeted every customer with a sincere smile, even when they ignored her. She complimented co-workers when they closed big deals, even when they never returned the favor. And when she was alone in the stockroom, scrubbing scuff marks off the floor, she hummed softly to herself. Songs her mother used to sing. In a world that seemed built to break people like her, Emma held on to her kindness like armor. She knew what it felt like to be invisible, but she refused to make anyone else feel that way, and perhaps that's what made her different. While the others polished their nails and scrolled their phones, Emma paid attention. She noticed when a customer looked unsure, when a co-worker's smile didn't reach their eyes, or when someone needed help but was too proud to ask. She moved through the boutique like a quiet guardian, her presence subtle but steady. And though no one ever said it aloud, the boutique ran smoother when Emma was there. She was the unseen thread that held the place together, but no one, not Melissa, not the senior staff, not even Emma herself could have predicted that her invisible kindness was about to change everything. The boutique had slipped into its usual afternoon rhythm heels, clicking against marble hushed laughter over overpriced cappuccinos and perfume hanging heavy in the air like entitlement. Emma was crouched near the front display, carefully refolding a cascade of silk gowns that Melissa had left in a mess after showing them to a socialite who didn't buy a thing. Her hands moved with practiced grace, tucking corners, just so smoothing seams with a delicate precision that came not from training, but pride. The others were too busy chatting by the register, gossiping about which client had Botox and who had money. No one noticed the bell chime, but Emma did. He stepped in quietly, the door slowly closing behind him. An older man hunched slightly, maybe in his 70s. His coat was weathered, the kind that once had structure, but now slouched with wear. His shoes were scuffed. One had a tear near the toe, and his white hair was windblown a little uneven, as if he'd cut it himself. He paused just past the entrance, taking in the crystal chandeliers and the gleam of golden racks, like he had stepped into a world that didn't belong to him. The moment Melissa looked up and saw him, her nose wrinkled. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her tone sharp, more warning than welcome. The man offered a small, polite smile. "Just browsing," he said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. That was enough for Melissa. She turned toward her colleagues with a scoff. "This isn't a thrift shop," she muttered, not quite under her breath. One of the senior associates laughed behind her hand. "Sir," another chimed in, "this boutique is for our premium clients. You might want to try the outlet store down the block." Laughter rippled among the staff. The man didn't argue. He simply nodded and turned as if to leave dignified, even in the face of cruelty. But Emma, who had stood unnoticed for too long in this place, moved. She stood up and walked toward him with quiet urgency. "Sir," she said gently, placing a hand just above his elbow, "would you like a glass of water?" The man blinked in surprise. "That would be nice," he said. His voice cracked with gratitude, and it struck something in her chest. Emma ignored the sideways glances and sarcastic whispers from her co-workers as she brought him to the client seating area, a plush corner usually reserved for high-profile buyers. She brought him a glass of chilled lemon water, the kind they served in crystal tumblers, and helped him sit down comfortably. "Take your time," she told him, smiling warmly. "Let me know if there's anything you need." The man's eyes met hers, pale blue and weathered, like the ocean during a storm. "You're kind," he said simply, as if surprised. "Most people wouldn't have looked twice at someone like me." Emma sat down on the armrest beside him, hands folded neatly in her lap. "Everyone deserves kindness," she replied. "Not just those wearing designer shoes." For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then almost in a whisper he added, "Good things happen to good people. Don't forget that, my dear." There was something in his tone that felt deeper, like those weren't just words, they were a reminder, a promise. Back behind the counter, Melissa watched with thinly veiled disgust. "She's embarrassing us," she snapped. Giving five-star service to a man who looks like he wandered in from a bus stop. But Emma didn't hear it, and even if she had, she wouldn't have cared. She looked at the man and saw more than the fraying seams of his coat or the tired lines on his face. She saw someone who deserved dignity, who reminded her of her own father in his final years, gentle, proud, and far too often overlooked. That small act of kindness, that simple glass of water, would become the moment everything changed for her, for him and for the world she thought she understood. The water glass trembled slightly as Walter placed it on the polished marble table, his eyes following the soft lines of Emma's face with a gentle warmth. He had sat quietly for a few minutes, soaking in the boutique's luxurious ambiance and Emma's sincere attention. Then, just as she was about to ask if he needed anything else, Walter leaned forward, his voice low but clear. "Would you help me pick out 10 outfits?" he asked. Emma blinked, unsure she had heard him correctly. 10, she repeated softly. "Yes." He nodded, smiling. "The best ones. Suits, shirts, shoes, everything." Her heart skipped. It was the kind of request that could make her entire month, maybe more. But around them, the room froze. From behind the jewelry counter, Melissa burst out laughing, her red nails tapping against her phone as she texted someone with an exaggerated eye roll. 10 outfits, she repeated mockingly. He probably can't afford one button, another associate. Taylor leaned against the counter, whispering loudly enough to be heard. Is she serious right now? That man's coat looks like it came from a donation bin. The whispers echoed like wind through a canyon, biting and cruel. But Emma, steady as ever, simply nodded to Walter and offered a small, respectful smile. "Of course, sir," she said warmly. "Let's find you something perfect." And so they began. Emma didn't rush. She treated Walter like any high-end client who walked through their doors. She studied his build, the slope of his shoulders, the length of his arms, the tone of his skin. She walked him through rows of Italian-made suits, hand-stitched silk shirts, and fine leather shoes without blinking. She selected a charcoal three-piece with subtle plaid lines, then paired it with a silver tie that brought light to his weathered face. "This will highlight your eyes," she explained. He chuckled softly, surprised at how much she noticed. With each outfit, she took her time adjusting hems, flipping collars, laying out full ensembles with elegance and care. While they moved through the boutique, Emma's co-workers stood back watching like spectators at a show they expected to end in disaster. "She's really going for it," Taylor whispered. "What's she trying to prove?" But Emma wasn't doing it to prove anything. She had always believed that how you treat people when you think no one is watching reveals who you truly are. And whether this man had money or not, she saw someone who deserved kindness. The fact that others couldn't see that only made her work harder, not for recognition, but for respect, dignity, and her own quiet pride. Walter remained calm, amused, even as Emma guided him from one section to the next. He admired the care she took, the way she ran her fingers gently across fabrics, tested seams, and offered small compliments without sounding rehearsed. No upselling, no pressure, just genuine service. Every time she brought him something new, he'd raise an eyebrow, nod thoughtfully, and ask her opinion. "Do you think this one suits me?" he'd ask. "It does," she'd say without hesitation. "But this one might suit who you're becoming." Her words struck him kind, thoughtful, layered with meaning. She wasn't just dressing him for the moment, she was treating him like someone with a future. Finally, after nearly an hour, Emma stood beside a beautifully arranged display of 10 complete outfits, each selected with care and a touch of her own artistic flair. She exhaled slowly, her heart beating a little faster. "I think these are the ones," she said. Walter looked at the collection, then turned to her with a look of genuine admiration. "Then I'll take them all," he said simply. Time stood still. Across the room, Melissa's laugh died in her throat. The other staff members' smirks faded into disbelief, but Emma didn't turn to see their faces. She stood tall eyes on Walter, lips curled into the softest smile. For once, it didn't matter what the others thought. She had done her job with grace, humility, and heart. The boutique had never felt so still. Emma stood beside Walter, the 10 perfectly coordinated outfits lined up in crisp symmetry across the cream velvet sofa. For a brief second, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. This sale wasn't just a transaction, it was a lifeline. It could restore the dignity Melissa had chipped away at for months, and perhaps, perhaps, her hard work had finally been noticed. Walter's expression didn't change as he nodded at the display. "I'll take them all," he said again this time. Louder, more resolute. Emma felt her heart skip, then flutter. This was real. It was happening. Her hands moved instinctively toward the checkout tablet, calculating the total. "That will be $217,000 before tax, sir." She said a nervous but genuine brightness in her voice. Then came the pause. Walter's hand moved slowly to his coat pocket. He patted once, then again. He checked the other side. His brows lifted slightly. "Oh," he said with a small chuckle as if amused at himself. "Would you believe I forgot my wallet?" The room didn't just go quiet, it imploded. Melissa's laugh was immediate, piercing, sharp enough to cut glass. She stepped forward with mock sympathy, clapping her manicured hands together. "Oh, darling Emma," she said with a sneer. He forgot his wallet. "How convenient." Taylor snorted. "Called it," she muttered. She just spent an hour playing stylist for a broke old man. Another staff member whispered loudly, "That's the most expensive dress rehearsal I've ever seen." Emma stood frozen, her smile slipping, but not vanishing. Her eyes flicked toward Walter. He didn't look ashamed. If anything, he looked thoughtful. "My grandson usually handles the payments," he said softly, offering a sheepish shrug. "He's quite wealthy. I just forgot to check in with him today. Melissa rolled her eyes so hard it was a miracle they didn't get stuck. A rich grandson, she mocked. Of course, maybe next. You'll tell us you own a castle in Scotland. The room erupted in laughter. Emma's cheeks flushed with heat, not from embarrassment, but from the sting of their cruelty. She glanced around, saw the judgment, the ridicule, and the smug delight etched into their faces, and yet she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned back to Walter, steady as always. She didn't know why, but something inside her refused to let this man walk out, humiliated. Without a word, she reached into the small zip pocket of her apron and pulled out the crumpled bills she had been saving all month. Just enough to cover a taxi home, maybe a little extra. Here, she said quietly, pressing the cash into Walter's weathered palm. At least let me cover your ride. A hush fell over the room again. Even Melissa didn't laugh. Walter stared down at her hand, his own trembling slightly as he accepted the money. You don't have to do that, he whispered. Emma smiled softly. I know. The gesture wasn't grand, but it echoed like thunder. It wasn't about the money. It was about the respect, the kindness, the refusal to treat someone as less because of how they looked. Walter closed his fingers slowly around the cash, his eyes glossy with something unsaid. You're rare, he murmured. Don't let them change that. Behind them, Melissa recovered her voice. Unbelievable, she scoffed. You actually gave your own money to a stranger. You do realize he just conned you, right? But Emma didn't respond. She was still looking at Walter, still choosing to see the person in front of her instead of the assumptions swirling around them. And as Walter stood and began to make his way to the door, his back slightly straighter than when he came in, Emma felt something shift, not in him, but in her. She had always been the invisible thread in the fabric of Regency wardrobe, holding everything together quietly without recognition. But in that moment she became something else, a quiet force of grace in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. The others might have seen a foolish girl helping a beggar, but one day soon they would realize just how badly they had misjudged not him, but her. The boutique returned to its artificial rhythm, but the air had shifted. The crystal lighting still glimmered, the floral aroma still wafted through the showroom, but something had fractured beneath the surface. Emma stood silently near the door, watching Walter's frail form disappear into the golden wash of the afternoon sun. She had given her last bills to help a man who by every outward measure had nothing to offer in return, yet she didn't regret it, not for a second. What hurt wasn't the loss of money, but the echoes of laughter that clung to her like dust. She turned to walk back to her folding station, but Melissa was already marching toward her heels, clicking like a warning bell. Melissa's expression was no longer performative. It was cold, livid, and unmistakably cruel. My office. Now she snapped without breaking stride. Emma followed her through the hallway past the displays of handbags and diamond jewelry into the back room lined with designer catalogues and staff rotas. The door clicked shut behind them. Melissa turned arms crossed tightly. You embarrassed this store, she hissed. You embarrassed me. Emma stood still, unsure what to say. You gave money to a street person. In front of our clients, in front of staff. Melissa's voice rose with each syllable. This is Regency. Wardrobe. Not a soup kitchen. Emma opened her mouth, but Melissa raised a hand. Save it. We're done here. Clean out your locker. There was no dramatic scene. No shouting. No tears. Emma simply nodded her throat tight and turned to leave. She walked slowly through the boutique, head held high, her heart breaking quietly inside her chest. The same co-workers who had laughed at her an hour ago now avoided her gaze. Melissa followed closely behind, making sure everyone saw the walk of shame. At the door, Emma paused to take one last look at the space she had cleaned, cared for, and committed herself to. It had never been hers, not really, but she had given it her best. Just outside, Walter stood across the street, leaning against a lamppost. He watched her leave. His gaze was calm, a glimmer of pride and sorrow behind his tired eyes. Emma didn't notice him. She didn't know who he truly was or what her gesture had just set in motion. She only knew she had been punished for doing what felt right, for treating someone with dignity, for choosing kindness over image. She walked past Walter without a word, unaware of the storm quietly brewing behind her, and Walter, still holding the crumpled bills she had placed in his palm, whispered under his breath, "They have no idea what they've just done." Back inside the boutique, Melissa stood at the front counter, fixing her lipstick in the mirror, like nothing had happened. "Good riddance," she muttered. "Let that be a lesson to the rest of them." Taylor gave a half-hearted laugh. She was too soft for this job anyway. Melissa nodded, confident, smug. To her, she had just cleaned house, removed a stain on the boutique's polished image. She believed she had done what any competent manager would do: protect the brand, reinforce luxury, maintain standards. In her eyes, Emma was a liability, and Walter was a nobody. There was nothing more to it. No weight to the moment, no consequence to her decision. But across the city, deep within the towering glass walls of the Brooks estate, a phone would soon ring. A name would be spoken, and everything Melissa believed about image, power, and control would begin to unravel, because she had just fired the only employee who had treated Walter Brooks, the founder's father, with respect. And in doing so, she hadn't just cost Emma her job, she had unknowingly opened the door to a reckoning that no amount of designer lipstick could cover. The taxi glided through the winding roads of Westchester County, its tires humming against the pavement as the city skyline slowly faded into sprawling fields and manicured estates. Walter leaned his head gently against the window, his reflection merging with the blur of trees and iron gates. The crumpled cash Emma had given him remained in his hand. He hadn't let go of it since she pressed it into his palm. There was something sacred about it now, not because of the amount, but because of the heart it represented. As the car passed through the towering wrought-iron gates of the Brooks estate, the driver's eyes widened in disbelief. "This is your house, sir?" he asked, stunned. Walter only smiled, handing him a generous tip. "It's home," he said quietly, stepping out into a world entirely different from the one he had just left. The estate was nothing short of regal, with its white stone columns, sweeping courtyards, and fountains that sang into the air. It looked more like a European palace than a home. Inside, marble floors glistened beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, and priceless art adorned every corridor. Yet despite the grandeur, Walter walked with slow familiarity, like a man returning to a place he'd outgrown. In the center of the living room stood Ethan Brooks, tall, sharp-jawed, and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit. As CEO of Brooks & Co., Ethan had built one of the most powerful fashion empires in the world. But in that moment, he wasn't a mogul. He was a grandson who had been worried sick. "Grandpa," he called, rushing over. "Where have you been?" Walter placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder, a soft smile breaking across his face. "I went for a walk through the real world," he said, Ethan's brows furrowed. "You were gone for hours. You can't just disappear like that." But Walter wasn't listening to scolding. He lowered himself into a leather armchair and gestured for Ethan to sit. "I met someone," he said simply. "Someone rare." With slow, deliberate words, he told Ethan everything. How he had walked into Regency wardrobe, dressed as no more than a weary old man. How the staff had ridiculed him, dismissed him, and laughed in his face, and how one young woman, just one, had chosen to treat him like a human being. As Ethan listened, his jaw tightened. The more Walter spoke, the darker. Ethan's eyes became, "They mocked you?" he asked, incredulous. "They tried to throw you out." Walter nodded, his voice, calm but firm, but she didn't. He said, a glimmer of pride in his voice. "Emma? That's her name?" "Emma didn't judge me. She didn't ask who I was or what I could buy. She simply saw a man who was thirsty and tired, and she gave me dignity." Ethan stood abruptly, pacing. His hands were clenched at his sides. "That boutique belongs to Brooks & Co., he growled. "They work for us, and they treated you like that." Walter looked up and met his grandson's eyes. "Yes, but that girl, she saved them from themselves." Ethan didn't wait. He snapped his fingers and his assistant Carter appeared in the doorway. "Get me everything you can find on an employee named Emma," he ordered. "Last name unknown. She worked at Regency Wardrobe. Find her address, her employment file, any CCTV footage, whatever it takes." Carter hesitated, blinking at the intensity in Ethan's voice. Sir Ethan's tone hardened. Now Carter nodded and vanished down the hall. Walter leaned back in his chair, watching his grandson with an unreadable expression. He had planted the seed, and now it was growing fast. "She's different," he said again, as if to himself. "She deserves better than what she got." Within minutes, Ethan was in his private office, the walls lined with fashion awards and press clippings about Brooks & Co. His meteoric rise, but today none of that mattered. He stood in front of a wall-sized monitor, watching security footage Carter had pulled from the boutique. There she was, Emma folding clothes, smiling at customers, carrying herself with quiet grace, even as others rolled their eyes behind her back. Then came the scene with Walter Ethan's fists tightened as he watched Melissa scoff, watched Emma offer her last bit of money, watched her hold back tears as she walked out with dignity. "Find her," Ethan said, again his voice low but resolute. "I want to see her with my own eyes." The rain had started just after sunset, soft and cold, painting streaks on the apartment window where Emma sat curled on her small couch. She was still in her work clothes, creases at the elbows, her name tag placed face down on the coffee table. The boutique badge felt like a memory, now something from another life. The apartment was silent, save for the low hum of traffic and the occasional creak from the hallway radiator. She hadn't told anyone what happened. Who would she tell? Her phone buzzed, once then again. A number she didn't recognize lit up the screen. She almost ignored it, but something, perhaps curiosity, perhaps instinct, made her answer Miss Emma. The voice was smooth, professional. "My name is Carter. I'm the personal assistant to Mr. Ethan Brooks. He would like to meet you." Emma blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "I'm sorry," who she asked cautiously. "Ethan Brooks," Carter repeated. "CEO of Brooks & Co." Emma sat up, her heart now racing. "I think you have the wrong person. We're quite sure we don't," Carter replied. "Mr. Brooks has seen footage of your kindness at Regency Wardrobe. You recently helped an elderly gentleman. That man was Walter Brooks, his grandfather." Emma stared at the wall, speechless. "Mr. Brooks would like to invite you to his estate to thank you personally." Carter continued, his tone calm but firm. "A car is waiting outside." Emma moved to the window and sure enough, a black luxury sedan waited beneath the street lamp, its headlights casting long shadows across the rain-slicked pavement. She hesitated. Everything about this felt too surreal, like a trap or a prank, or something she couldn't quite name. But then she thought of Walter, the way he'd smiled at her, the warmth in his eyes. That part had been real, and something in her heart told her to go. She grabbed her coat, her fingers trembling as she locked the door behind her. When she slid into the car's back seat, she expected leather, but not the kind that felt like butter beneath her fingertips. The interior was silent, save for the soft rhythm of raindrops on glass. As they pulled away from her neighborhood and toward the city's edge, she tried to calm the swirl of questions in her mind. Why her? What did they want? She wasn't special. She was nobody. But the world she was about to enter would soon tell her otherwise. The gates of the Brooks estate opened without a sound, revealing a property that seemed carved out of a dream. The mansion itself stood tall against the night sky, its facade lit with golden uplights that made it look like something from a royal painting. As the car came to a stop, uniformed staff opened her door with practiced elegance. Emma stepped out slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The marble steps, the chandelier in the foyer, the silence that felt sacred. "This way," Miss Emma Carter said gently, guiding her through the front entrance. Her shoes clicked against the polished floor as they walked down a corridor lined with portraits, founders, leaders, legacies. Names she'd seen in fashion magazines and company profiles now looked back at her from oil-painted frames. They entered a grand sitting room where two men waited, One she recognized instantly from magazines. Ethan Brooks. Tall, poised with striking features and an effortless command of the room. The other she knew from memory, the man she'd handed her last bit of cash to just days ago. "Walter," she whispered. The older man smiled, stepping forward. "Emma," he said warmly, "you came." She turned back and forth between them, struggling to connect the two versions of reality, who she thought they were and who they truly were. You're his grandfather?" she finally asked. "And you?" She looked at Ethan, heart racing. "You run Brooks & Co." Ethan's voice was calm but direct. "Yes, and we owe you more than you know." Walter stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You didn't ask who I was. You didn't try to impress me. You just helped." Emma's eyes brimmed, but she didn't let the tears fall. She stood in a room full of power, wealth, and reputation, but it was her compassion, her quiet grace that had opened the door. Ethan gestured to the chair across from him. "Please," he said, "sit. We have a lot to talk about." And as she took her seat, still trying to steady her breath, Emma realized something profound. Her life had already changed. Not because of money, not because of fame, but because of one simple truth. Kindness had brought her to the doorstep of something extraordinary. The fire crackled softly in the grand room as Emma sat across from Walter and Ethan. Her fingers curled gently around a porcelain teacup she was too nervous to drink from. The chandelier above her glowed like a crown of stars, its light casting soft reflections onto the polished marble floor. Everything around her was immaculate, refined, tasteful, unimaginably expensive, and yet the only thing that truly made her nervous was the way both men were looking at her. Not with judgment, not with pity, but with quiet admiration. Walter leaned forward in his chair, his eyes sparkling with the same warmth he had shown her in the boutique. "Emma," he said gently, "I've lived a long time and I've met all kinds of people, but you're the kind of woman a man should build a future with." Emma's breath caught. The statement wasn't romantic. It was something deeper, something ancestral, like a man passing down wisdom to shape his family's destiny. "You're kind, you're strong, and you have a heart that sees beyond appearances." Walter continued, "That's rare. And that's exactly what my grandson needs." Ethan didn't react with surprise. In fact, he didn't flinch at all. Instead, he looked at Emma with a steadiness that made her cheeks warm. "He's right," Ethan said quietly. "When I saw the footage of what you did, how you treated him, I knew I had to meet you. And now that I have, I know you're even more remarkable than I expected." Emma looked down, trying to process the praise. She wasn't used to being seen like this. Not by people who lived in penthouses and moved markets with a signature. Then, without ceremony, Ethan stood and motioned to Carter, who reappeared almost instantly with a sleek black velvet box and two gold-trimmed shopping bags. Carter placed the items on the coffee table in front of her, bowed slightly, and stepped back. "These are for you," Ethan said. His voice smooth but sincere. Emma hesitated. Inside the bags were designer dresses hand-stitched in Paris. The box revealed a glimmering set of custom diamond jewelry. And then, resting at the very bottom, Carter revealed a third item. Car keys to a Rolls-Royce parked in the driveway. Ethan added almost shyly, "It's yours if you want it." Emma froze. The sheer weight of the gesture was staggering. I can't accept this," she stammered. Ethan looked confused for a moment. "Why not?" he asked gently. Emma's hands trembled as she placed the keys back into the velvet lining. "Because I didn't help your grandfather for a reward," she said softly. "I didn't even know who he was. I just did what felt right." She looked up at him, her voice steadier now. "If I accept these things, it changes what that moment meant. And I don't want to lose that." The room fell silent. Even Walter looked moved. For all their wealth, for all the people who had tried to buy their favor, here was a young woman refusing a fortune not out of pride, but out of principle. "You are extraordinary," Ethan whispered. Walter smiled and stood walking over to her with a surprising lightness for a man his age. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Then let us do something else, he said warmly. No gifts, no strings, just an invitation. Emma looked up at him, curious. Stay with us, he said. Not forever, just for a little while. As our guest. As my guest, I haven't had company like you in a long time. Emma opened her mouth to object, but Walter held up a hand. No expectations, no pressure, just a place to rest, to breathe, and maybe to start again. She looked at Ethan, who nodded in silent agreement. We'd be honored, he added. The moment lingered in the space between them, unspoken, tender, fragile. Emma's heart beat rapidly as she weighed her answer. She had no family to return to, no job, no obligations beyond survival. And here, in this mansion of marble and memory, someone had offered her a chance to just be. With a trembling voice, she said the words that would change her future. Okay, I'll stay. Walter's eyes lit up, and Ethan smiled, genuine, gentle, and full of something he didn't yet have the words for. The girl who had once folded dresses for commission was now a guest in the house of billionaires, not because of what she wore or who she knew, but because of the heart she carried. The sun had barely cleared the hedges of the Brooks estate when the piece shattered like glass under a heel. A bright red convertible pulled into the courtyard, its engine roaring like it belonged in a car show, not a quiet mansion driveway. The staff barely had time to turn before the door swung open, and Rachel Sinclair stepped out. Immaculate as ever, in her designer heels, oversized sunglasses, and a trench coat cinched so tight it looked more like armor than fashion. Rachel strutted up the marble steps with purpose. She didn't need an invitation. She never had. For years she had floated in and out of Ethan Brooks's orbit at parties, galas, board meetings, never quite his girlfriend, but always close enough to be mistaken for one. The moment she stepped into the foyer and spotted Emma standing near the grand staircase with Walter, something in Rachel's expression hardened, her eyes narrowed, her smile thinned. Leo! She called out sweetly, using the nickname she'd claimed since college. Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, rolling up the sleeves of his shirt. Rachel, he said, polite but distant. Rachel's gaze flicked back to Emma. And who, may I ask, is this? She said. Voice laced with faux warmth, Emma started to answer, but Walter beat her to it. This, he said cheerfully, is Emma, our guest. Rachel's eyes gleamed. Guest, she echoed. How lovely. And what exactly does she do? Her tone carried an undertone Emma knew too well, the kind used by people who saw kindness as weakness. Before Emma could form a response, Ethan descended the stairs, his steps firm. She doesn't have to do anything, he said, his voice calm but unmistakably protective. She's here because she deserves to be. The room quieted. Rachel blinked, stunned that Ethan had spoken so firmly, especially in front of staff. Of course, she said, with a dry laugh, flipping her hair over one shoulder. I just thought, she seems young and simple. She let the words hang, pointed and cruel. Emma's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Ethan stepped beside her, folding his arms. Watch your tone, Rachel, he said, his voice colder now. Emma is a guest in this home, and you will treat her with the respect she's earned. Rachel froze. For all her years of floating near power, she'd never been publicly checked like that by Ethan. Not once. Not in a hallway. Not in front of staff, and especially not over another woman. Her smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes cracked. Of course, Ethan, she said smoothly, but the way she looked at Emma could have burned stone. She excused herself with a quick step and disappeared down the corridor, but everyone in the room could feel it. The tension she left behind was like perfume, sharp and lingering. Walter patted Emma's hand with a quiet smile as if to say, You handled that with grace. Rachel didn't go far. She slipped into the guest parlor and slammed the door once she was alone. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but fury. Emma, of all the people. Some no-name girl who wore flats instead of heels, who didn't know a thing about fine wine or fashion labels, was suddenly staying at the Brooks mansion and being defended by Ethan like royalty. Rachel had spent years cultivating her proximity to him, staying just close enough to be considered, just irreplaceable enough to be kept. And now it was all unraveling. This girl had to go. And Rachel, for all her socialite sweetness, had never been the type to lose quietly. She began plotting that very night, digging into Emma's background, calling in favors from gossip bloggers, whispering half-truths to acquaintances with big mouths. If she couldn't shame Emma with charm, she'd destroy her with rumor. But what Rachel didn't know, what she couldn't even begin to understand, was that Emma hadn't come to the Brooks estate seeking power. She wasn't playing a game, and that made her the most dangerous person in the room. Because Emma didn't need attention to matter, she had already won over the people who counted. And as Rachel prepared to wage her petty war, she didn't realize she was already losing the one thing she cared about most. Ethan's trust. Emma stood on the terrace of the Brooks estate, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea as the early morning mist curled through the hedges. The serenity of the mansion hadn't yet worn off, but a familiar restlessness stirred in her chest. She wasn't someone who could sit still and be served, especially not now after everything. That afternoon over lunch on the garden patio, she turned to Ethan, her voice quiet but firm. "I want to work," she said. "I need to earn my place. I can't just stay here and do nothing." Ethan set his fork down and studied her. She expected him to gently discourage her offer another gift instead, but instead he leaned back in his chair and said, "Good. I was hoping you'd say that." Within days, she found herself standing in the sleek glass lobby of Brooks & Co. headquarters, dressed in a modest but elegant outfit. Her resume in a folder clutched to her chest. Ethan had made no promises, but after a private interview in his office, he made a decision that would send ripples through the company. Emma would be his personal assistant. It was more than a title. It was access to his schedule, direct reports, and the company's inner workings. The HR department processed it in stunned silence. Emma's desk was placed just outside Ethan's private office, and the reactions were immediate. Whispers swept through the hallways like wildfire. Employees stared, made comments behind her back, and smiled through gritted teeth. "She must be sleeping with him," someone murmured in the break room. "Did you hear she got hired without a formal application?" Another added, "Just a nobody who got lucky." One of the senior assistants sneered. Emma kept her head down and worked meticulously, managing Ethan's calendar, coordinating high-stakes meetings, drafting documents, and learning the systems faster than anyone expected. But even her diligence didn't stop the rumors. Notes were passed. Snide comments left just loud enough to hear, "It won't last." Someone whispered one afternoon, "Once Ethan gets bored, she'll be gone." But Emma didn't flinch. She'd survived far worse than gossip. She hadn't come here to be liked. She came to prove she belonged. The gossip eventually found its way to Rachel. Though she wasn't an employee of the company, her connections gave her a revolving door into its social circles. She used them masterfully, planting doubts, fueling the flames. And when a private company dinner was announced, she made sure to attend that evening in the rooftop lounge of the Brooks Tower beneath golden lights and a skyline that looked like fire-meeting glass. Rachel waited for the perfect moment, and when Emma entered, simply dressed but composed, Rachel struck. "How's the view from the assistant's desk?" she asked sweetly, her voice loud enough for nearby ears. A few people chuckled. Must be nice, getting promoted straight from the street. The room fell quiet as Ethan stepped forward. He had arrived minutes earlier, watching from a distance, his eyes darkening as Rachel spoke. Now he stood beside Emma, his presence sharp and undeniable. "That's enough," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. Rachel blinked, caught off guard. Ethan turned to the room. "Let's get one thing clear," he said. "Emma didn't get this job through favors or shortcuts. She earned it with integrity, patience, and grit things some of you seem to have forgotten how to value." The silence deepened. Rachel's smile faltered. Ethan wasn't finished. If I hear one more word of gossip, one more joke, one more whisper that diminishes her value, you'll be packing your desk. I don't care who you are." Rachel tried to recover, her lips parting as if to argue, but Ethan's gaze silenced her. "You had your chances, Rachel," he added, softer now, but no less pointed. "And you wasted everyone." Then he turned back to Emma, his expression softening. "Let's go." He offered her his arm, not for spectacle, but for solidarity, and together they walked out of the lounge, leaving behind the whispers, the tension, and a room full of people who for the first time truly saw Emma not as a charity case, or a fluke, or a mystery, but as someone whose presence was rewriting everything they thought they knew about power, grace, and what it really means to earn your place. Late one evening, the office at Brooks & Co. was bathed in the quiet golden hue of desk lamps and city lights. The workday had long ended, and most of the building was dark, but two offices still glowed, Ethan's and Emma's. She was seated at her desk, fingers dancing over the keyboard, sorting contracts and preparing the next day's meeting agenda. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching her with a look he hadn't shown anyone else in years. It wasn't just admiration, it was something gentler, more personal. She hadn't just proven herself at work, she had shifted something in him. After a long pause, he finally spoke, voice steady but warm. "Emma," he said. She looked up. "Yes?" He hesitated for only a beat, then added, "Go out with me." Emma blinked, unsure she had heard him correctly. "What?" she asked, almost laughing. Ethan stepped closer. "Go out with me." He repeated, a small smile forming. "Dinner. No business, just us." Emma felt the room tilt slightly, her heartbeat picking up pace. "You're serious," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "I don't play games." "Emma." She studied his face, searching for a smirk or a trick, but there was only sincerity. After everything, his defense, his belief in her, his quiet presence when the world turned against her, she saw the truth behind his words, and slowly, with a breath she didn't know she was holding, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's go." Their first date was private, tucked away at a rooftop restaurant where the only view more breathtaking than the skyline was the way Ethan looked at her. They talked for hours about life, about loss, about beginnings that felt like ends and endings that brought new beginnings. There were no masks, no roles to play, just two people who against all odds had found something real in the middle of chaos. Over the weeks, that connection deepened. They became inseparable, quiet walks in the city, late-night takeout on the balcony, shared glances that spoke louder than words. It didn't take long before word spread. One photograph, one headline, billionaire CEO Ethan Brooks, dating former boutique assistant. The media latched on fast, modern-day Cinderella. They called her gold digger. Others sneered. Emma tried to ignore it. She focused on work, on integrity, on the values that had brought her this far. But the whispers followed her everywhere, from tabloids to boardrooms, and behind the scenes, someone was fanning the flames. Rachel. She watched from the sidelines, rage burning behind her designer sunglasses. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had built an identity off her connection to Ethan, nurtured rumors, flirted at functions, posed beside him at galas, and now some girl with second-hand shoes had stepped into her place publicly, permanently. So Rachel did what Rachel did best. She called in favors, leaked selective truths, and spun gossip like silk through the media. The stories turned sharper. Who is Emma Hayes? Really, one headline asked. From salesgirl to CEO's sweetheart, what's her endgame? Another blared anonymous quotes appeared online about how fast the relationship had moved, about how inappropriate it was for a CEO to date his assistant. Emma's name trended for the wrong reasons, but Rachel wasn't done. She picked up the phone and made one last call to someone whose opinion still carried weight with Ethan. His mother, Victoria. Rachel said sweetly, "I thought you should know. Your son is in trouble, and this time, it's not just about the company, it's about reputation." There was a pause on the other end, then Victoria's voice, cool and precise. "I'll be on the next flight. Back at the Brooks estate, Emma sat quietly with Ethan on the garden steps. The headlines didn't matter here. The lights from the fountain glowed soft on their faces. "I didn't ask for this," Emma said softly. "I never wanted attention, just a fair shot." Ethan looked at her, his hand reaching for hers. "I know," he said, "and that's exactly why you're the one I want beside me." She smiled, just barely, but it was real. Still, neither of them knew that far above on a plane cutting through midnight clouds, Victoria Brooks was crossing the country, ready to fight for her son's legacy. And if Rachel had her way, destroy the woman who had quietly stolen his heart. The air inside the Brooks estate was heavier that morning, quiet, not in peace, but in anticipation. Emma felt it before she even saw Victoria Brooks. The staff moved more carefully. The housekeepers whispered. Even Carter, typically unshakable, checked his watch 3 times before speaking, and then, like a storm in satin heels, Victoria arrived. She stepped out of her private car dressed in a structured navy suit, her silver hair pulled into a bun so precise it looked carved. She didn't knock. She didn't wait. She entered the house as if it were still hers, the echo of her heels cutting through the marble halls like a gavel. Emma was waiting in the drawing room Ethan had left early for a board meeting. She stood as Victoria entered, her hands steady, even as her heart pounded. "Emma," Victoria said, not bothering with pleasantries. She sat across from her without invitation, crossed one leg over the other, and opened a slim black folder she had carried in like a weapon. "I won't waste your time." From the folder, she removed a checkbook. The pen she used had her initials engraved in gold. Her movements were precise, practiced. "You're young, intelligent in your own way, and I'm sure you mean well, but you don't belong in our world." She wrote the numbers slowly, deliberately, then tore the check from the book and placed it on the table between them. $5 million. "This," she said, her voice calm and cool, "is yours. Walk away from Ethan. Disappear quietly. Start over somewhere else." Emma stared at the check. Her breath caught in her chest, not because of the number, but because of what it represented. A lifetime's worth of security offered as a bribe to erase her from someone's life. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and looked Victoria in the eyes. "I'm not here for money," she said softly. "I never was." Victoria's brow twitched, barely perceptible. "Then what are you here for?" Emma inhaled slowly. "Because I love him," she said simply. "Because when I met Ethan, I didn't even know who he was. I helped a man who needed help. I stayed because your family showed me kindness. And now, I stay because of who he is, not what he owns." Victoria studied her in silence. She was used to negotiation, to people who flinched at confrontation or melted under pressure. But Emma didn't fold. She didn't raise her voice, didn't cry, didn't posture. She just sat there, steady, honest, immovable. The check remained untouched on the table like a challenge. Finally, Victoria leaned back slightly, a flicker of something unexpected passing through her eyes. "Respect. You really think love is enough?" she asked. Emma nodded. "It's not about enough," she replied. "It's about what's real, and I won't walk away from something real just because it makes other people uncomfortable." The silence stretched. Then slowly, Victoria reached forward and took the check back. She didn't rip it. Victoria Brooks didn't do dramatic. She simply slid it back into her folder and snapped it shut. "You're stronger than you look," she said almost to herself. She stood, her posture still sharp, but something in her gaze had softened. "I don't like being wrong," she added as she turned to leave. At the doorway, she paused, looking back at Emma one last time. But maybe, just maybe, he chose right. And with that, she was gone, her heels clicking down the hall, leaving behind a woman who had just won the quietest war of her life. Without raising her voice, Emma sat there for a long moment after the door closed. Her hands were still in her lap, her chest still tight with adrenaline. But her heart felt steadier than ever. She hadn't needed to prove herself with grand speeches or perfect words. She had just been herself. And somehow, that had been enough. In the hallway, Carter passed Victoria as she exited. He caught her expression, neutral but thoughtful, and glanced toward the drawing room where Emma remained. Something had shifted. Not everything, not yet, but it was a start. And sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest acts of courage, like refusing $5 million to keep believing in love. It started with a scream. A maid had opened the armoire in Emma's guest room while tidying, only to freeze as something glittered behind a stack of folded sweaters. A diamond necklace, rare, unmistakable, and reportedly missing from the Brooks estate's private collection for nearly a week, rested inside a black velvet pouch. Within an hour, chaos descended. Security was called. Staff whispered. Emma, returning from a walk in the garden, stepped into a storm she didn't see coming. "Miss Hayes," one guard said stiffly, "we need to ask you a few questions." She was confused but calm until she saw what they held in their hands. Her knees nearly buckled. "I didn't take that," she said immediately. Eyes wide. "I've never seen that before in my life." The interrogation was swift and cold. No formal accusations, not yet. Just suggestion, suspicion. Glances that lingered too long. Emma could feel the walls closing in her breath, catching with every second. It didn't matter how many kind things she had done, how hard she had worked, how much she had proven herself, because in the eyes of the powerful, even a whisper could fracture trust. Victoria Brooks was present, her face unreadable. Walter was nowhere to be found. And Ethan hadn't come home. Emma sat in her room that night, staring at the empty jewelry box on the table, her heart in her throat. Was this how it ended? Framed, forgotten, alone. But Ethan wasn't gone. He was in his office downtown, watching hours of surveillance footage with Carter and two tech specialists from the internal security team. When Carter had called him about the incident, Ethan had felt a fury so complete it chilled his blood. Something wasn't right. He knew Emma. He had seen the way she lived, worked, loved. She wouldn't steal a bracelet, let alone a $1 million heirloom. He scrubbed through footage from the estate's security cameras, hallways, entrances, guest room, corridors. Hours passed. His eyes stung from staring. And then just after 1 a.m., Carter's voice broke the silence. There on screen, a woman in a trench coat moved through the hall. Not Emma, Rachel. The footage was damning. Rachel slipping down the hallway late at night, glancing around before entering Emma's room. A pause. Then her re-emerging with empty hands. Carter enhanced the footage. She carried a small black pouch on her way in, gone on the way out. She planted it. Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. She set Emma up by morning. Ethan was back at the estate, a portable monitor in hand, storming into the great hall where Emma was quietly sipping tea under the cautious eyes of the staff. Without a word, he plugged the monitor into the room's projector. The footage played. Gasps echoed through the marble space. Rachel, who had just arrived for brunch, froze mid-step. Ethan turned to her, slowly, eyes like steel. "You framed her," he said. His voice not raised but lethal. Rachel's face contorted. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop," Ethan snapped. "It's over." Walter appeared at the top of the staircase. Having watched from above, Victoria stood slowly, saying nothing, but her expression was unmistakable disgust. Security approached Rachel. "Miss Sinclair," one guard said firmly, "you're being placed under arrest for false accusations and tampering with private property." Rachel's voice cracked as she backed away. "Ethan, I did it for you. I was trying to protect you from her." Ethan didn't flinch. "You don't even know what love is." The last thing Rachel saw before being escorted out in handcuffs was Emma standing, tall, eyes full of grace. After Rachel was gone, the silence in the room was suffocating. But it was Victoria who broke it, slowly rising to her feet and facing Emma. "I misjudged you." She said, her voice quieter than usual but honest. "I thought you were a risk to our family. Turns out you were the only one protecting it." Emma's eyes shimmered, but she said nothing. Walter walked to her side and placed a proud hand on her shoulder. Good people always rise, he whispered. Ethan didn't say anything right away. He just crossed the room, took Emma's hand, and held it like something sacred. Because it was. And for the first time in days, Emma let out a breath. Not in defeat, but in relief. Her name had been dragged through the mud, but the truth had pulled her out. And now, with the lies behind them, something far greater was waiting ahead. The sky outside the Brooks estate was dressed in velvet that night. Stars scattered like whispers above the horizon. Inside, the world had stilled. A soft glow illuminated the private terrace just off the east wing of the mansion. Candlelight flickered along the railing, lining the garden path in golden halos. Emma walked slowly toward the table, set at the center. Just two chairs, a single floral centerpiece, and the quiet hush of something extraordinary about to happen. Ethan stood waiting. His hands folded his suit, simple but elegant. His gaze fixed on her with an intensity that softened the moment she met it. No press, no photographers, no audience. Just them and the kind of silence that said everything. Dinner had been brief but meaningful. They barely touched their food, each word between them, heavier than wine, more nourishing than any meal. Emma couldn't help but smile. Despite everything, the chaos, the betrayal, the headlines, this moment felt untouched. It felt sacred. When dessert was cleared and the candles burned low, Ethan rose from his chair and stepped beside her. "Emma!" He said, his voice a little unsteady for the first time she could remember. She looked up at him, a question already forming in her eyes. "There's something I've wanted to do for a long time," he continued. Then, without flourish, without performance, he knelt. Emma's breath caught. Not because of the spectacle, there was none, but because of the quiet, unshakable truth in his expression. Ethan pulled a small velvet box from his jacket and opened it to reveal a diamond ring so elegant, so timeless, it seemed to shimmer with meaning. "I don't care about the rumors," he said. "I don't care what the world thinks. I care about you. I care about how you made my grandfather feel like a person when everyone else forgot. How you held your head high, even when it would have been easier to walk away. You've changed my life, Emma. I don't want another day without you in it. Will you marry me?" Her answer came not in a word, but in a tearful nod, a smile breaking through the emotion, and a whispered, "Yes." The next morning, the media erupted. Ethan Brooks engaged to former assistant Emma Hayes. Headlines spread across every platform, from boutique to billionaire, a love story for the ages. Social media exploded with speculation, celebration, and envy. Photos of them holding hands on the estate terrace, taken by a discreet family photographer, circulated like wildfire. Some praised Emma's humility and resilience. Others predictably scoffed at the idea of a Cinderella story. But Emma didn't care. For the first time in her life, she had found something stronger than gossip, truth, and love that didn't require permission to exist. A week later, Ethan took Emma back to where it all began. Regency Wardrobe. The boutique hadn't changed, still pristine, still smug, still soaked in the perfume of elitism. When they walked through the glass doors, the staff froze. Melissa behind the counter in her signature heels and a new designer blouse turned with her rehearsed customer service smile. It dropped the moment she saw them. "Mr. Brooks," she said cautiously. "Miss Hayes." Ethan raised a hand to silence her. "You don't need to speak," he said, his voice steady. "You had the opportunity to treat someone with dignity, and you failed. You mocked my grandfather. You fired the only person in this boutique who showed integrity." He paused, letting the silence build. "You're done here." Melissa's face paled, her lips parting in disbelief. You're firing me," she stammered. Ethan nodded. "You're not just fired from this location. You're permanently barred from ever working with Brooks & Co. again." As the words settled into the silence, Emma stood beside him. Not as a former employee, not as a quiet girl folding dresses, but as a woman who had walked through fire and emerged unburned. The staff watched as Melissa gathered her things in a daze, the echo of Ethan's final words hanging in the air. "Kindness is the new luxury, and we will never tolerate cruelty in its place." And with that they turned and walked out hand in hand into a future neither of them had seen coming, but both knew they'd earned. The morning of the wedding dawned with a quiet majesty. The sky was an endless expanse of soft blue, the kind that artists try to capture but never quite can. Outside the Grand Cathedral in Manhattan, black-tie chauffeurs opened doors for guests dressed in the finest couture. News crews hovered at the periphery, their cameras capturing glimpses of the arriving elite film stars, fashion moguls, political dignitaries, and even a few crowned heads. Inside, white roses cascaded from the rafters, and a string quartet played in harmony with the hush of anticipation. But it wasn't the spectacle that had people whispering. It was the bride, Emma Hayes, a woman who had once been dismissed as ordinary, now the center of the most extraordinary celebration the city had seen in years. Emma stood in the bridal suite, gazing at her reflection. Her gown was a masterpiece, ivory silk, hand-stitched lace, and a cathedral-length train that shimmered like moonlight. A tiara rested gently in her hair, designed not for royalty by blood, but royalty by grace. As she clutched her bouquet, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from awe. Every moment, every tear, every insult she had ever endured had brought her here. There was a knock at the door. Walter entered, walking slowly, a velvet box in his hands. "Before we go," he said softly, "this belongs to you now." Inside was a brooch, gold, sapphire encrusted, passed down for generations in the Brooks family. "It's tradition," Walter added. "It's worn by the woman who holds the heart of this family. Today, that's you." When Emma stepped into the aisle, the cathedral rose to its feet. Ethan stood at the altar, breath caught in his chest, eyes locked on hers. He had seen her in boardrooms, in gardens, in quiet corners of the mansion, but nothing compared to this. As she walked toward him, arm in arm with Walter, the air seemed to change. There was no whispering now, only reverence. She wasn't just marrying into wealth or power. She was becoming part of a legacy, one built not just on fashion or business, but now on integrity. When she reached Ethan, he took her hand, grounding her, anchoring her, reminding her that this wasn't a dream. It was real, and it was theirs. The ceremony was intimate despite the grandeur. They exchanged vows that were quiet, honest, and deeply personal. Emma didn't speak of fairy tales. She spoke of coffee runs, long nights, broken beginnings, and the strength it takes to stay soft in a hard world. Ethan spoke of learning how to lead with heart, how watching Emma love his grandfather had taught him more about honor than any boardroom ever had. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, they didn't rush. They just looked at each other for a long moment. Two souls who had weathered storms separately and now had found calm in each other. Their kiss under the stained glass glow of the chandeliers wasn't performative. It was a promise fulfilled. The reception was held at the Brooks estate, transformed into a wonderland of candlelight crystal and curated beauty. Every detail was perfect, from the 12-tier cake to the live orchestra, but the most precious moments were the quiet ones. When Walter toasted Emma as the heart our family never knew we were missing. When Victoria, dressed in a muted silver gown, placed her hand on Emma's and whispered, "You were right all along." And when Emma slipped off her heels near midnight to dance barefoot on the marble floor, her laughter echoing louder than the music. She was no longer the girl folding clothes in the back room of a boutique. She was the woman who had redefined what it meant to belong. As the night drew to a close and fireworks burst over the estate, Ethan pulled Emma into his arms beneath the final flare of gold and blue. "You changed everything," he murmured. Emma rested her head on his chest. "No," she whispered back. "You just saw me when no one else did." And in that moment, surrounded by the echoes of music, family and memory, Emma's journey came full circle, from being mocked for her simplicity to becoming a symbol of strength, from losing everything to finding the one thing worth everything. And as they stood beneath the stars, husband and wife, the world faded around them, because the real fairy tales aren't made of castles and crowns. They're written by kindness and lived by those brave enough to love without condition. If stories like this moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the quiet power of kindness, Don't forget to subscribe to Deep Inside HQ. We bring you cinematic stories with heart stories about justice, redemption, courage, and the human spirit. Every view, every like, and every share helps us continue creating meaningful content that speaks to the soul. Join our growing community of viewers who believe in storytelling that uplifts and transforms. Click subscribe, turn on notifications, and be part of the journey, because sometimes the deepest truths come from the quietest voices.